Homage to the Triple Gem. So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and I'm still at Gendagala Aranya in Ratanapura, and probably here for about another week or so, and then heading off to do some exploring. With luck, might be able to find a place for a kuti, attempt number 2 of who knows how many, we'll see. So time will tell. So the other day, it was actually maybe a couple of weeks ago, was asked a question, which was a really good one, which was, the person was saying that as they meditate, they get more energy, and then they spend that energy on their lay life. And when they spend their energy on their lay life, it gets kind of depleted, and then they have to meditate again in order to re-get more, to generate more energy so that they can again spend it or so, I guess. And this is a kind of a really interesting paradox. So when people first come to Buddhism, especially in the West, it's often for the sake of enhancing their lay life. So, their life. When we say lay life, most people when they come to Buddhism are not monks. They come to Buddhism as lay people, not knowing much about it, if they're coming from a Western culture usually, and just basically wanting to try to find a way to reduce the amount of suffering that they have. And having tried many other avenues, they then turn to look for a way to reduce suffering in their mind through training their mind. Because often people have tried just about so many other things and are feeling at the end of their options sometimes. So what people tend to find is that when they do start training their mind, they gain more mental clarity. And with that mental clarity, they can kind of spend it on things like having a better relationship in whatever way with their children, with their parents, with their spouse, or even finding a spouse or things like this. And part of this is because when people don't have any type of training in the mind at all, they haven't trained or shaped their mind much at all, then over time, growing up in a Western society, a person's mind tends to become shaped by their quest for various sensual desires. Tends to become shaped by their quest for awards, for status, for fame, for things which actually society often says are good, like cars or houses or various types of food. And of course, this quest can sometimes lead into negative territory like drugs, alcohol, etc. So a person's mind has been shaped by the quest to find and consume these things quite often if they're coming from a Western culture. And the thing about the way that sensual pleasures work is that in consuming these things, they actually undermine the ability to get them sometimes. Kind of consuming junk food, consuming buying a new house, whatever it might be, indulging in these things. It actually can be a distraction for the mind and reduce the mental clarity that on a larger scale is what allows, say, society as a whole, the clarity, the initiative to get these things in the first place. So when we come to practice meditation, we kind of start to meditate and gain more mental clarity, and then go out and spend it on things, spend it on relationships, spend it on doing more work, spend it on whatever it might be. Once that is spent, then again the mind is depleted, and one can find oneself back in the same emotional state that one was in before. And so one has to meditate again or go on another retreat or whatever it might be. Now, part of the problem with this is actually the place where a person is looking for happiness and the type of happiness that they feel they're going to get from it. And so people, out of habit, assume that the happiness that they want is going to come from more sensual pleasures. Or if I could just have a better relationship, if I could just have a better relationship with food, and maybe not be so addicted to the same junk foods or to coffee or chocolate or whatever it might be, then my life would improve. And so there's this assumption that the suffering that a person is feeling is because they have this problem with chocolate, or they have this problem at work, or they have this problem with relationship X, Y, or Z. The assumption is the suffering that I'm feeling is because of this problem. And if this problem were fixed, then the suffering would go. So this is what they're looking for. They're looking in this place. They're looking for sensual pleasures, for a stable type of happiness. They look to their life for a stable type of happiness. And the way in which they're looking for it, and kind of looking for it through consumption. The thing about sensual pleasures is it's built into sensual pleasures that they can never truly satisfy. So the problem isn't, they may have proximate problems like my addiction to chocolate or whatever it might be, but the sensual pleasures themselves have suffering built into them. If you consume one chocolate bar, then your ability to enjoy the next one actually decreases with each subsequent chocolate bar. And so the ability to enjoy a sensual pleasure actually depends on its lack. And the hungrier a person is, the more delicious a meal tastes. The more full a person is, the less delicious a meal tastes. So this is one of the things that's built into sensual pleasures. The other thing that's built into sensual pleasures is that as one consumes the sensual pleasure, one undermines one's ability to get it. So you can imagine if, for example, one is working all week and saving up money for 2, 3, 4 paychecks. Then, after that month and a half or whatever it is that one has saved up that money, one goes out and spends it on something. One goes out and, maybe has a vacation or, buys some big ticket item that one really wanted. So in the spending that money, in the consumption of that money, one is not producing it. So one loses it. And not only that, in the consumption of that sensual pleasure, one is essentially directing the mind, training the mind towards non-effort, towards non-mindfulness, towards non-clarity. It's what people look for when they look for a sensual pleasure. They bite into the food and it gives them a break for however long that overwhelming sensation is. They're not usually mindfully and closely paying attention to the taste of the food because the taste of the food is not so satisfying. It's actually just kind of blanking out. When one goes on vacation, one isn't trying to be, extra diligent in what one is doing. One is trying to let the mind go and relax and be swept away by whatever it is that one is doing. Often, there's of course variations on these things, but sensual pleasures graph in this way. Because they graph in this way, when one consumes them, one loses the mental clarity that one needs to get them. There's this paradox built into them, which is why the world spins around on each other. It spins from gain to loss in this case, the gain of sensual pleasures to their loss. So there's a paradox in this producer-consumer system that exists for basically everything in samsara. So one of the solutions to this paradox is what you might call this vicious cycle, where you produce something, you get it, you consume it, it falls away. You produce something, you get it, you consume it, it falls away. And this occurs on smaller levels, like, I'm happy, I had a good time with my friends, now my happiness is gone. Or I had these really nice conversations, the next conversation, I don't have it, my happiness is gone. Or, I had this money, I saved it up, I spent it on the vacation, now the money's gone, I've got to work again to go on another vacation. So this kind of vicious cycle is built into sensual pleasures, and the solution to it is to focus less on being a consumer and looking for happiness and consumption, and to learn more and more to focus on the process, to focus on being a producer. So, of course, if one just focuses on producing, there's going to be some suffering in that. Like, imagine somebody who just saves money all the time and never spends money. Somebody like that is actually experiencing suffering from work and has no suffering or has no happiness from consumption. So it's a pretty tricky existence. It's not an existence that many people would necessarily say is super pleasant. But there are people who actually learn to gain pleasure in the work that they do, in the craft that they do for its own sake. And there does seem to be almost like a recommendation for that in the canon, in something which the Buddha calls accomplishment and initiative, where whatever occupation a person is good at, they learn to become very skilled in that. And this is one of the things that leads to happiness in this life. So for people who learn to focus on being the producer, they can get more happiness, and often they can get more wealth. It's one of the interesting things, like another paradox, is that apparently many, not all, but many billionaires actually don't seem to care that much, much less than one would expect. about very fine sensual pleasures. They're often like these people who are in it for like an adventure. They're in it for the principle. They're in it for the process. And some of them live lives which, are surprisingly unwealthy. And kind of, there was one fellow I knew one monk I knew who's a venerable, who's very senior and actually was taught me some really important things. And his father is this really, really rich man. He's a billionaire. And he was kind of making this comment like, yeah, being on your private jet and your 10-year-old t-shirt. Kind of wearing this kind of like tattered old t-shirt while you're on your private jet. And so this principle actually can apply in the world as well. One learns to enjoy the process of being the producer and enjoy that more than being the consumer. And this is a paradox that leads to more wealth. But for our purposes in terms of meditation, it's not like we're trying to produce more worldly wealth. What we're trying to find is happiness. And there can be a certain happiness that one gets from focusing in on producing the causes for the happiness rather than consuming them. And here, the causes being producing the clarity of mind, producing the mindfulness, the activities that go into that. One focuses one's desire and effort on these things, rather than say on the clarity of mind that one gets using it to have better relationships, using it to be able to do more work. So when one focuses on the process in this way, then of course the clarity of mind, the mindfulness, the happiness that's inside can grow. And this can produce its own type of happiness, which the Buddha calls jhana. If one learns to focus mindfully on the present moment in whatever one does, one doesn't allow one's mind to go out to the past or the future, then this can lead to this happiness called jhana, which is a superior type of happiness to sensual pleasures, but is still produced. It's still something which you have to be mindful and in the present moment and not letting the mind go out in order for a person to produce that. So even with the jhanas, even with the kind of pleasure that arises from meditation, if one sends one's mind out to consume that and wallow in it, it falls away because one is not focused on being the producer. But it can still be there. It can still be there and give one a lot more satisfaction than sensual pleasures. So this is a step up from the consumption of sensual pleasures. But it can still have a dynamic of producing and consuming. And if one starts to wallow in the pleasure, if one starts to feel like that pleasure is one's possession, then it falls away because one stops putting the causes into place. And one can notice this in worldly life as well. If a person starts to feel like, I'm this, really talented, really rich person, I'm this really intelligent person, whatever they think is theirs, they become complacent about putting the causes into place to keep it going, then it falls away. I was actually talking to somebody recently, and they have these kind of like gifted programs in at least Canada and the United States. And there seems to be a kind of trend, like many of the people I talk to who are in that program or know people who are in that program, they actually sometimes are much less successful than people who weren't in that program, although they have these really high IQs, and if you associate with those people, you can see they're quite smart. But one of the things that they get taught in those programs quite often is you're very smart, you won't have to work hard to get what other people get. So they think, I'm smart, I'll always be successful. Things will always come to me easily, because this is what they're taught. And the way the world works is, even if a person is smart, there's a certain point at which hard work can completely overtake that natural ability. And so what one tends to find is that when people focus on these things, like I'm smart, I'll be able to do things easily, then they don't put the causes into place to do the hard work necessary to succeed all the time. In some cases, of course, they do, but more than one would think because of this teaching. People who were in these programs actually don't end up in like really good jobs. Sometimes it's like working in a factory or working at like a normalish job, not like a very high academic post or a very high policy making position. They're in a normal job, which is not bad, of course, but they may have had the potential to do more. And because they grabbed onto this idea, this is who I am, stop putting the causes into place, then this thing fell away. So in addition to being the producer, focusing on the happiness of the process, one also wants to have the mind state of like an investor. So one takes a portion of that mindfulness and reinvests it. Right? It's not like one can't have good Dhamma discussions with friends, or that one is somehow trying to destroy any happiness that there may be in one's life. But it's like climbing a ladder. So one lets go of the lower rung and grabs the other one that's higher, and then lets go of the lower rung with the other hand, the other foot, and completely lets go of it. Stands on a higher rung. But to do this, one has to invest some of one's energy to grab the higher rung. So one can, as a layperson, still take some of that clarity and use it to have relationships that are more in line with the Dhamma, more kind. And especially the Buddha recommends 6 different relationships, and they have reciprocal duties to them. So if a person invests in making their relationships more like that, then spends some of their clarity on making their relationships more like that. Well, that's a good thing, and it will pay dividends in terms of one's practice as well. But one also wants to take a portion of this clarity and reinvest it in more clarity. So the energy that one gains from mindfulness, one wants to apply to developing the skill of mindfulness further. The energy that one gains from meditation, one wants to take that and invest it to develop the skill of meditation further. And this is like grabbing onto the rung. So the problem, of course, with this whole paradox, this whole vicious cycle, is that it occurs in anything where there's this producer-consumer dichotomy, and that dichotomy is everywhere, in everything in samsara. It permeates every aspect of samsara. So the only solution to this is to find a happiness that does not depend on being produced and isn't consumed. And so the Buddha says there is the unborn, the unformed, the unmade. I think it's unproduced is another translation perhaps. The unoriginated. So there's a happiness. There's something that's not produced. If it's not produced, then it doesn't die. So it's not consumed. It doesn't fall away. That's where this paradox is relinquished. So, or overcome or solved. So as one climbs the ladder higher and higher, reinvesting, and of course one along the way there are types of happiness. One can have the happiness of better relationships. One can have the happiness of right livelihood. But the path actually self-destructs. So to reinvest in higher forms of happiness, one has to let go of the lower ones to a certain extent. Actually, as one goes along, one ends up spending less time in relationships, less time on work, less time on right livelihood, and more time on meditation. If one can do this, one can get the happiness that comes from meditation. But ultimately, wherever there's a production, there's a consumption, there's the falling away, there's this vicious cycle. So this reinvestment, like climbing a ladder, has to eventually be invested in finding something that is not produced or consumed. So this is the goal of a person's practice, the aim for which they're practicing for. It's to climb the ladder higher and higher, and eventually to reinvest in such a way that one can step off of the ladder, jump off of it onto the roof. And that means jumping off of this whole cycle of production and consumption. And it's only when one has let go of this thing fully that this paradox has been resolved, of production and consumption. And that one can find something that's truly satisfying. So one should watch carefully where one looks for happiness and how one looks for it. When one looks for it in sensual pleasures, built into those is their own destruction. One looks for it in things that one has to produce, their destruction is built into their consumption. And so ultimately our aim is to find this, something that is not produced and not consumed. This is the right place to look for happiness. It's a place where this paradox can be resolved, and it's a place where people will not be disappointed.